Judge Judy SCREMS at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett on live TV. But what Jasmine says next stuns the entire nation. What started as a heated debate turns into a viral moment that exposes deep truths about justice in America. Stay to the end to find out the quiet sentence that changed Judge Judy forever. Like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on this powerful and emotional story. It was supposed to be a harmless daytime panel. One of those televised political roundtables meant to stir debate, entertain the middle-class lunch crowd, and throw red meat to the polarized masses. A network special branded justice and accountability in the age of outrage. Hosted by a blend of courtroom icons and rising political stars. A clever gimmick. Something to fill airtime between scandal montages and pharmaceutical commercials. But what aired that day did more than fill a time slot. It cracked open a fault line in American civic life. At 3:02 p.m. Eastern, the cameras rolled. Sitting across from each other under the sharp lights were two women who had, in very different ways, become symbols of American justice. Judge Judith Sheindlin, better known to the world as Judge Judy, was the undisputed queen of courtroom television. A woman whose mere eyebrow could send shivers through the spines of petty crooks and negligent landlords. And then there was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a former public defender turned progressive firebrand from Texas, whose rise in the House had come not from compromise, but from conviction. The panel topic that afternoon was respect for institutions. Where did it go? The producers had expected some sparks. They didn't expect a firestorm. The argument began, as most things do in American politics, with crime. Specifically, a question about recent footage of over-policing in black neighborhoods and the public's growing distrust of judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement. Judge Judy, wearing her signature no-nonsense scowl, was the first to speak. "People don't respect the courts," she said, tapping the table with her gavel-shaped pen. "Because they don't respect order. They don't respect discipline. And quite frankly, they don't respect themselves." Jasmine didn't flinch. She nodded once slowly, as if mentally logging every syllable before she responded. "Respect isn't a one-way street," she said, folding her hands on the table. "You don't get to demand respect from communities that have been historically targeted, brutalized, and ignored by the very systems that now beg for their trust." What followed wasn't a debate. It was a confrontation, and it escalated with surgical precision. "Excuse me, young lady," Judge Judy snapped, pointing across the table. "I've been in courtrooms longer than you've been alive. I've seen what happens when people stop listening to authority. The chaos, the entitlement. You think you're doing your constituents a favor by sowing distrust? You're not. You're stoking division." Jasmine leaned forward, expression steady. Her voice, low and unhurried, cut through the theatrics like a scalpel. "And I've seen what happens when authority goes unchecked. I've held mothers in my arms after their sons were dragged out of homes for the crime of being black and poor. I've represented people who spent a decade behind bars for mistakes a white teenager would have walked away from with a warning. So no, what I'm doing is truth-telling, and if that's divisive, maybe the truth isn't as respectable as we pretend it is." That's when Judge Judy snapped. "I will not sit here and be lectured by a child in lipstick playing revolutionary on cable TV." Her voice boomed across the set, shaking even the seasoned producers in the control room. "You think justice is some performance art for your social media followers? I've earned my place. You're just performing rage for ratings." The room froze. Even the stagehands went still. It was the kind of moment that usually ends a conversation or a career. But Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't blink. She let the silence stretch for a few seconds longer than comfortable. Then, she said something that would be replayed in video montages, political ads, and cultural commentary pieces for weeks to come. "Judge Sheindlin, with all due respect, the reason people are listening to me now is because for decades, women who looked like me didn't get to speak. And when we did, people like you told us we were too angry, too young, or too loud. But here's what you don't seem to understand. This isn't about me. It's about the mirror I'm holding up. And if you don't like what you see, maybe that's the problem. The broadcast cut to commercial, but the moment had already gone viral. Within the hour, clips of the confrontation were trending on every major platform. Hashtags like hashtag Jasmine versus Judy and hashtag Truth in Lipstick flooded timelines. Twitter turned into a cultural war zone. Fox News called it a disrespectful ambush. MSNBC ran it on repeat with words like iconic and generational reckoning. But behind the digital hysteria, something deeper was happening. For all her bravado and viral zingers, Jasmine Crockett hadn't intended to become a symbol. At least not like this. She wasn't trying to own Judge Judy for likes. She was trying to force a national reckoning with how America treats its sacred institutions. Not with deference, but with interrogation. She believed that justice wasn't static, that it had to be confronted, questioned, even screamed at sometimes. In the days that followed, both women issued carefully worded statements. Judge Judy stood by her words, saying that she was frustrated by the lack of decorum and respect from certain corners of our political leadership. Jasmine released a video response filmed in her congressional office. No glam team, no teleprompter, just her in a navy blue blazer, saying quietly, "If the truth sounds like disrespect, maybe we've been respecting the wrong things." But what truly shocked the nation wasn't the argument. It was what the argument revealed. In the hours following the broadcast, thousands of emails began pouring into Crockett's office. Not hate mail, not threats, but stories, heartbreaking, raw, and at times unbearably personal. A 65-year-old black woman in Baltimore wrote, "Thank you for saying what I couldn't say when they took my grandson away." A white public defender in Minneapolis confessed, "I've idolized Judge Judy my whole life, but today I finally understood what she's missing." A former inmate in Louisiana sent a message that simply read, "You told the truth. That's all I ever wanted someone to do." And then came the backlash. Prominent conservative figures began attacking Jasmine with ruthless precision. Her criminal defense record was dredged up. A 5-second clip of her from a protest in 2020 was taken out of context and played on a loop. One senator called for her censure. Another accused her of trying to cancel the judiciary. But something strange was happening this time. Jasmine wasn't backing down, and the public wasn't turning on her. That's when the networks tried to spin it back into spectacle. Cable news hosts invited the two women for a rematch. Judge Judy declined. Jasmine, in a now-famous tweet, wrote, "This ain't a reality show. It's real life. And real life doesn't do sequels." What no one realized yet was that this wasn't just a viral skirmish between generations or ideologies. It was the opening salvo in a much larger war about the future of accountability in America. And it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By the following Monday morning, the confrontation had metastasized from a viral moment to a national phenomenon. Sunday talk shows dissected it like a political autopsy. Academic panels, op-ed columns, and YouTube commentators all scrambled to extract deeper meaning from 10 minutes of live TV. But beneath the noise, something rare was taking shape. A reckoning that couldn't be neatly reduced to political camps. It wasn't just that Jasmine Crockett had clapped back. It was how she'd done it. No shouting, no theatrics, just a slow, deliberate rebuttal delivered with the icy composure of someone who had weathered worse in rooms far less televised. That restraint, her refusal to escalate, seemed to unsettle her critics even more than any actual anger would have. What began as a cultural spat quickly evolved into a policy flashpoint. A week after the broadcast, Congresswoman Crockett introduced a resolution in the House titled the Institutional Accountability Act. designed to audit the racial disparities in judicial sentencing at both federal and state levels. It was bold, far-reaching, and almost certainly doomed in committee. But it wasn't about passage. It was about planting a flag. The backlash was swift and coordinated. Conservative PACs began flooding Facebook with attack ads, some AI-enhanced, others crudely edited to paint her as a radical threat to law and order. One segment on a primetime cable show labeled her the most dangerous woman in Congress, a title she later quipped she might put on a t-shirt. But here's the part the media mostly missed. Crockett wasn't just battling Judge Judy or right-wing pundits. She was wrestling with an institution far more entrenched than any one television icon. The American myth of neutral justice. It's a myth Jasmine knew intimately. Her years as a public defender had taught her that justice was rarely blind. It was often deaf, and sometimes deliberately so. She remembered vividly the 17-year-old client who was tried as an adult for stealing headphones, while a banker's son got probation for assault. She recalled the judge who once told her, off record and with a wink, that "Your boys are lucky when they walk out of here in cuffs instead of boxes." And she remembered how many times she'd stood silent in court, swallowing her rage just to make sure her client didn't bear the brunt of her outburst. So when she looked across that studio table at Judge Judy, what she saw wasn't just a woman with decades of experience. It was a symbol of performative justice, a brand, polished and packaged, that had normalized the idea that justice was about sass and sound bites rather than nuance and systemic rot. It wasn't personal, it was cultural, and that's what made it dangerous. Behind the scenes, Crockett's office became a war room. Death threats, voicemails filled with racial slurs. One handwritten letter, postmarked from Indiana, simply read, "You should have been aborted." Her staff began sleeping in shifts. Capitol Police increased patrols around her home. And yet, something else happened too. Letters from public defenders flooded her inbox. Judges, quietly, anonymously, wrote to say they supported her push for reform, but couldn't say so publicly. One federal magistrate from New Jersey sent a 3-page typed letter breaking down his own frustration with mandatory minimums and prosecutorial overreach. But the most surprising message came from an unlikely source. It arrived by courier. A private note, handwritten in cursive, slipped inside a cream-colored envelope bearing the return address of Scheindlin Productions. No cameras, no social media blast, just a short, deliberate message from Judge Judy herself. "Disagreements aside, you held your ground. That matters more than I admitted in the moment. J.S." Jasmine read it twice, then 3 more times. She didn't tell the press, didn't leak it, didn't tweet. It sat in her drawer for 3 weeks. Instead, she kept pushing. She accepted invitations to speak at law schools, not just in the blue corners of the country, but in places like Ohio, Missouri, and Georgia. Places where justice was often transactional and defense attorneys were viewed with skepticism. She delivered lectures not with righteous fury, but with uncomfortable clarity. "The courtroom is not neutral ground," she told a crowd at the University of Georgia. "It's a battleground of bias, economics, and institutional power. And if we don't name that, we're complicit." Meanwhile, public sentiment began to shift. Polling showed a strange, unexpected uptick. Support for criminal justice reform among independents increased by 6 points in 1 month. Approval ratings for Jasmine among millennials surged. She became a featured voice in a New Yorker spread titled, "The New Faces of American Justice." Meanwhile, Time listed her as one of the 100 most influential people of the year, placing her next to Dr. Anthony Fauci and Liz Cheney. But with the spotlight came scrutiny and risk. A leak from a Judiciary Committee staffer revealed that Crockett's name had been added to a list of priority surveillance members, a quiet designation meant to alert certain intelligence agencies if she began coordinating anti-institutional protests. When a journalist broke the story, the backlash was explosive. Civil liberties groups demanded answers. Crockett's team filed a Freedom of Information Act request. Nothing came back, except a blank page with 3 words stamped in red: classified for oversight. Jasmine knew then that this wasn't just about a television argument. It was about power. Who held it, who challenged it, and how far those in charge would go to silence dissent. And then came the Senate hearing, unrelated on paper, but symbolically explosive. The hearing was convened to discuss the increasing radicalization of young lawmakers and their impact on the stability of American institutions. Crockett wasn't scheduled to speak, but when one senator from Arkansas held up a printed still of the TV confrontation and sneered, "This is what the public thinks justice is now?" Jasmine stood up, without invitation, without microphone, without fear. She walked to the center of the chamber, her voice loud enough for the cameras and the spectators above. "This isn't about justice. It's about control. You don't get to insult me, vilify me, surveil me, and then pretend it's about decorum. You want me quiet because I make you uncomfortable, because I name the rot you've spent your careers pretending doesn't exist. But I won't be quiet, because your comfort is not my obligation." The room erupted. Some booed, others clapped. But everyone knew, at that moment, something irreversible had happened. A young black congresswoman had just broken the fourth wall of American governance. Not with profanity, not with spectacle, but with truth. And as the video of that unsanctioned speech went viral, surpassing even the original confrontation with Judge Judy, Jasmine Crockett realized that this wasn't just a moment anymore. It was a movement. By the end of that month, something else had shifted. Something less visible than trending hashtags and louder than any televised scream. Jasmine Crockett was no longer merely a congresswoman with a public defender's backbone. She had become, whether she wanted to or not, the new face of resistance. Not to one judge, not to one branch of government, but to a myth that had ruled American life for decades. The idea that justice was impartial, incorruptible, and immune to the biases that had birthed it. But as the momentum behind her movement surged, so did the quiet institutional pushback, subtle, bureaucratic, deniable. Her legislative calendar was suddenly more congested than usual, as if committee chairs were intentionally overloading her with procedural obligations to keep her off the floor. Funding requests for her district, which had passed without resistance in prior sessions, began to stall in committee, replaced with budgetary concerns and pending revisions. Long-standing colleagues grew unusually cold. The silent signals of congressional retribution were unmistakable. Meanwhile, the media turned fickle. The same networks that once played her confrontation on loop began shifting their tone. Some painted her as polarizing. Others accused her of eroding institutional credibility. The very accusation she had warned would come the moment a black woman told uncomfortable truths to a predominantly white establishment. But the public wasn't done listening. A CNN town hall in Atlanta offered a stage. This time, it wasn't Judge Judy across from her. It was an audience of ordinary Americans, handpicked from every political stripe. Union workers, veterans, law students, retired judges, ex-inmates. Moderated by Anderson Cooper, the event was billed as Justice in Real Time, America's Reckoning. Jasmine arrived without a team, without prepared remarks. Just a folder of handwritten notes and a navy blue dress she'd worn 3 times before. She didn't need polish. She needed presence. And when Cooper asked, "What do you say to those who claim you've disrespected the courts?" she didn't pause. "I say respect has to be earned, and no institution, no matter how old, how revered, how draped in marble and oak, gets a blank check. I've been in too many courtrooms where justice looked different depending on the skin color of the defendant. And if pointing that out is disrespect, then I guess I've been disrespectful since law school." The crowd didn't erupt. They leaned in, and that mattered more. Then came a voice from the back. A woman, elderly, black, wearing a faded church hat. I remember when they told Thurgood Marshall he was undignified for asking questions white lawyers were afraid to ask. The woman said, "Don't let dignity stop you from saving lives." The crowd did erupt then. That single moment, unscripted, unrehearsed, became the town hall's defining image. A still frame of Crockett turning toward the woman, eyes brimming, one hand on her chest, the other gripping the lectern. The photo hit the front page of the Washington Post the next morning beneath the headline, "The question America wasn't ready for." That same day, however, Jasmine received something far more sobering, a legal summons. A lawsuit had been filed by a group of concerned citizens, coordinated by a newly formed conservative legal foundation. The charge? Incitement of anti-judicial sentiment leading to threats against public servants. It was ludicrous on its face, a performative stunt meant to discredit her movement by dragging it through the mud of legal theatrics. But it had teeth, because it wasn't about conviction. It was about headlines, about spectacle, about silencing. Within hours, Fox News was running cheer-in banners that read Crockett sued over judicial threats. Never mind that she had never threatened anyone. Never mind that the threats against her had been documented, archived, and reported. The damage was in the headline. She called her attorney that evening, a civil rights litigator she'd once interned for in Dallas. His voice was tight with rage. "This isn't law. It's political warfare in a black robe." Jasmine exhaled slowly. She wasn't surprised, only tired, not of the fight, but of how predictable the retaliation had become. "You ready to take this all the way?" he asked. "I've been ready since the first time I lost a case I should have won," she said. The case didn't go away. It dragged her through weeks of depositions, hearings, subpoenas. Her congressional colleagues grew quieter. Even her allies advised her to temper the rhetoric. But she refused. And yet, there was a moment, late one night, in her empty office, long after the staff had gone home. She sat alone with the lights off. The Capitol dome glowed outside her window. She stared at the summons papers on her desk and whispered, "What if I'm wrong? What if I've pushed too hard?" The doubt wasn't weakness. It was weight. The weight of a country's dysfunction resting on the back of a woman, expected to carry it with grace while being kicked by the very boots of power she was trying to clean. Then she remembered something her mother once told her during her first year of law school, after she lost a trial defending a black teenager in a petty theft case. "Some people lose and still change the system. Others win and never change a thing. Just decide which one you want to be." She stood up, picked up the phone, called her lawyer. "Let's take this public," she said. They filed a counterclaim the next day. Crockett v. the American Judicial Accountability Foundation, charging malicious prosecution and coordinated character assassination. The move shocked pundits. No sitting member of Congress had ever filed a civil suit against a political watchdog group. But Jasmine wasn't a typical member of Congress. And then, once again, the unexpected happened. Judge Judy returned. This time, not on a talk show, not in a press statement, but in a New York Times editorial, titled, "When Discomfort is Necessary," Scheindlin wrote, in language far more nuanced than her courtroom persona. "Congresswoman Crockett and I disagreed publicly, loudly, but I have since reconsidered the role we each play. She holds a mirror. It is not always flattering, but it is necessary. And if the legal community cannot face its reflection, perhaps it is the legal community that has changed, not her." The editorial went viral. For the first time, the national conversation turned from the confrontation to the deeper question it represented. What is the role of discomfort in democracy? Who gets to ask the hard questions? And why does the system flinch when the questions come from people it once silenced? Universities began hosting forums titled Justice, Voice, and Institutional Fragility. Law students organized reading groups around Crockett's congressional speeches. And for the first time since the hearing, public approval of the judiciary dipped. Not out of disdain, but out of awareness. And yet, the final blow, the one that would change the course of Jasmine Crockett's career and the entire architecture of American legal reform, hadn't come yet. It would arrive not from a politician, nor from a judge, but from a mother. Her name was Danica Reynolds. She was 34, a nurse, and the mother of a 13-year-old boy killed by police in Mississippi under suspicious circumstances. Mistaken identity, they said. The family had been fighting for 3 years to reopen the case. Danica flew to D.C. to testify in a closed-door congressional subcommittee meeting. She didn't weep. She didn't shout. She simply handed Jasmine a folded piece of paper, then turned to the panel and said, "If none of you are brave enough to ask the hard questions, maybe step aside for those who are." After the meeting, Jasmine opened the paper. It was a photo, her own TV confrontation with Judge Judy, printed from a screen grab, grainy and pixelated. On the back, Danica had written in blue ink, "This saved my life. I stopped believing in justice. You reminded me that someone still sees us." That night, Jasmine Crockett knew, with absolute clarity, she could never go back. There are moments in political life that fracture time. Before and after. Silence and rupture. After that hearing, after that photo, after that folded note from a grieving mother, Jasmine Crockett stopped reacting and started advancing. What had begun as a flashpoint, a viral clip, a courtroom celebrity, a clash of generations, had hardened into something more dangerous to the status quo, moral momentum. She no longer waited for permission. Her counterclaim against the so-called judicial watchdog group sent waves through the legal community. Think pieces emerged titled The Crockett Doctrine, speculating whether elected officials could or should file legal retaliation against politically motivated lawsuits. But Jasmine wasn't retaliating. She was exposing. Her legal team, working around the clock, traced the network behind the lawsuit to a thinly veiled web of dark money nonprofits tied to former judges, prosecutors, and think tanks dedicated to judicial stability and preserving courtroom integrity. Dog whistles, in reality, for silencing reform and maintaining the illusion of objectivity while communities bled. The counterclaims discovery phase unearthed a damning set of internal memos. One, in particular, changed everything. Dated just 4 days after the original TV confrontation, a memo from the Foundation's legal strategy team read, "Target must be neutralized immediately. Her calmness is more dangerous than aggression. Reframe as hostile to courts. Utilize Schindlin persona for public optics, but ensure separation if sentiment shifts." It was clinical, chilling, clear. They hadn't feared Crockett because she yelled. They feared her because she didn't. Jasmine's team made the document public in a press conference aired on every major network. Standing beside her lawyer, she read the memo aloud to the cameras, ending with a single pointed line. "If the system is this afraid of a calm black woman asking questions, imagine what it's hiding from you." The fallout was swift. Petitions circulated demanding investigations into judicial lobbying networks. Senate Judiciary Committee members, once skeptical of Crockett's message, called for hearings on dark money in legal advocacy. And in one of the more surreal turns of the saga, Judge Judy herself was subpoenaed to testify, not as a defendant, but as a witness to the cultural weaponization of judicial symbolism. The hearing was tense. C-SPAN viewership spiked into the millions. Americans watched, transfixed, as the woman whose voice once commanded a mock courtroom show now sat under oath, fielding questions about her real-world influence. She didn't equivocate. "I may play a version of myself on television," Schindlin said, But I have never authorized any political group to use my image to suppress questions about justice. And if they did it in my name, they did it without my permission." The hearing adjourned, but what it left behind was historic. The first formal acknowledgement from a legal celebrity that their persona had been co-opted not by fans, but by political strategists. Back at home, Jasmine's district felt the tremors. Once just a blue bastion in a red state, it became a crucible for civic dialogue. Churches hosted community justice nights. Local judges, inspired or shamed, or both, agreed to public town halls with residents to explain sentencing decisions. Police departments began inviting public defenders to help redesign training curriculums. And then came the invitation that made Jasmine pause. The Harvard Law Review asked her to write a guest editorial. Not about the confrontation, not about the lawsuit, but about what comes next. She almost said no. She hated the idea of reducing everything that had happened into a digestible academic essay for people who'd never stepped into a courtroom where your client wore shackles before the jury even heard opening arguments. But then she remembered the faces. Danika's, the 17-year-old she'd once defended, the young girl who DM'd her to say, "I showed your video to my civics class. I didn't know I could talk back to power." She wrote the essay in one night, titled "The Cost of Calm," on disrespect, decorum, and the danger of silence. It opened with a single paragraph that would later be cited in law courses across the country. "We are told that change must be polite, that injustice should be addressed with decorum, inside structures designed by the very forces we seek to challenge. But sometimes, the most radical thing a black woman can do is speak calmly when expected to scream, because the system is built to ignore volume, but it panics when met with composure. The system survives chaos. What it fears is clarity." The editorial was reprinted in The Atlantic, Vox, and even The Federalist, albeit under the headline "Crockett Admits to Strategy of Political Theater." The usual bad faith actors would try again to paint her as a performance artist. But by now, the nation had heard her speak too many times to believe that lie. Then, just when it seemed the moment might crest and fade, a whistleblower came forward. An assistant director at a prominent state bar association. Anonymous, terrified, but determined, she delivered a USB drive to Jasmine's office through a journalist intermediary. On it were 76 audio recordings, internal calls between judicial officials and political operatives discussing Jasmine's movements, affiliations, even plans for where she might travel next. But one clip stood out. "She's forcing us to answer questions we've avoided for 40 years. If we don't delegitimize her now, she'll pull the whole damn curtain down." The journalist released the tapes. Congressional hearings followed. Jasmine was called to testify. Again. But this time, she was not alone. At her side were 12 public defenders from across the country, a retired black judge, a Latina law professor from New Mexico, a trans civil rights attorney from Alabama, a former inmate who had graduated from Columbia Law School. They didn't chant. They didn't march. They walked in together, wearing navy suits and carrying small folders. When Jasmine spoke, her voice was raw, but resolute. "You asked if I respect the courts. I do. That's why I hold them accountable. That's why I demand better. Respect isn't blind loyalty. It's the courage to say, this isn't good enough. We can love justice and still say the system has failed." The chamber fell silent, not from offense, from recognition. After the hearing, a member of the Judiciary Committee approached her privately. "You know this isn't over," he said. "I know," Jasmine replied. "That's why I'm still here." The next day, a new resolution was introduced, the Judicial Transparency and Reform Act, authored by Crockett, co-sponsored by 27 members. It proposed mandatory diversity audits for federal benches, annual sentencing disparity reviews, and real-time public access to judicial misconduct investigations. Would it pass? Unlikely in the current climate. But that was never the point. It was a line in the sand, a statement that, from now on, the courtroom was no longer a place where the voiceless remained voiceless. And Jasmine Crockett, calm, relentless, unshaken, was proof of that. But the story still wasn't finished, because someone was about to make a move that would take everything Jasmine had built and twist it into something she never saw coming. The play came quietly, without cameras, without the spectacle that had defined every chapter of the saga thus far. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a viral moment. It wasn't even a public rebuke. It was something more insidious, a move from the shadows. On a Wednesday afternoon, just after Jasmine finished a closed-door policy roundtable with youth activists, she received a message slipped under her office door. No return address, no signature. A simple typed note. Check Judiciary Docket 221B. She did. Buried deep within the federal judiciary's docket, beneath a stack of case filings that had yet to be made public, was a pending motion by a little-known judicial oversight committee calling for the censure and ethics review of sitting members of Congress who had engaged in rhetoric causing demonstrable erosion in public trust in the courts. There were only two names listed in the memo, hers and one other, a freshman senator from New York who had co-sponsored her Judicial Transparency and Reform Act. It was the bureaucratic version of a silencer, a procedural move so obscure, so carefully coded in legalese, that the public wouldn't notice it until the damage was already done. This wasn't backlash. It was sabotage. And it worked. Sort of. The resolution triggered a cascade of delays. Crockett's committee assignments were frozen pending ethics clearance. Her bill, which had gained surprising bipartisan curiosity, was moved to a subcommittee chaired by a man who once publicly stated that the system isn't perfect, but it's better than any alternative Black America has proposed. She could feel the ice forming beneath her feet again, but what her adversaries hadn't counted on, what they never understood, was that Jasmine Crockett didn't need the institution to validate her. She wasn't asking for a seat at the table. She was asking why the table only had 4 legs when the house was sinking. So she took the fight back to the streets, back to the courtrooms, back to the city halls and the church basements and the college lecture halls where real civic change begins. Not with headlines, but with hard questions. She launched a nationwide listening tour titled The Mirror Sessions. No press, no party talking points, just a mic, a chair, and an open door. From Detroit to Jackson, from Albuquerque to Pittsburgh, people came. People who had never trusted a politician. People who had lost brothers to wrongful convictions and sisters to broken plea deals. People who hadn't stepped into a courtroom without fear since the day they were born. And they didn't come for spectacle. They came for one thing: to be seen. Jasmine didn't campaign. She didn't self-promote. She listened. She listened to the white mother from Tennessee, whose son was in prison for fentanyl possession, while the prosecutor's nephew got rehab. She listened to the Latino father from Arizona, whose daughter had to change her name on job applications just to be taken seriously after being acquitted. She listened to a Black trans woman in St. Louis who said simply, "Justice never learned my name." And each time, she said the same thing in return: "Your story matters. Let's bring it into the record." She began compiling them. Thousands of testimonials, case summaries, affidavits, letters. Her team assembled what would later be called the People's Docket, a 500-page compendium of lived experiences across the American legal system. It wasn't data. It was truth. Raw, unfiltered, undeniable. She presented it on the House floor 6 months after the confrontation with Judge Judy. "This is your mirror," she said to her colleagues. "If you look into it and still say our system works fine, then maybe you're not fit to legislate it." That speech made its way into the congressional record. It also made its way into every social justice law class at Georgetown, Howard, Berkeley, and Harvard within weeks. The People's Docket was published in print and online by the Congressional Research Service, an unprecedented move that sparked both outrage and awe. Even critics were forced to recalibrate. She was no longer just the woman who kept her cool when Judy Sheindlin screamed. She was the woman who made screaming unnecessary. A year passed. The ethics review? Quietly dismissed, without acknowledgement or apology. The Judicial Transparency and Reform Act? Still languishing in committee, but now with 39 co-sponsors and support from organizations that had once shunned her for being too disruptive. And then, one final surprise. In the spring, Jasmine received an invitation. Not from the media, not from Congress, from Judge Judy herself. It was private. Just lunch. No cameras. No media statements. They met in a small cafe in Manhattan, where Sheindlin was known but rarely recognized without her TV hair. Jasmine wore jeans and a turtleneck. Judy wore her usual black and pearls. They didn't talk about the confrontation. They didn't talk about politics. They talked about legacy. Sheindlin admitted something no one else had ever heard her say. I wanted justice to be accessible, you know? On TV, in people's homes. But somewhere along the way, I made it look too easy. I forgot how complicated it really is. Jasmine smiled softly. You didn't forget. You just had no one to remind you. There was a long pause. Then Judy said, You remind people. You scare the hell out of them. But you remind them. Don't stop. That was it. No joint interview. No reconciliatory op-ed. Just two women, two symbols of justice from very different worlds, passing something unspoken across a table that had long been reserved for men with gavels and pens. In the months that followed, Jasmine Crockett kept doing the same thing she'd done from the beginning, showing up, listening, asking questions that made people flinch. And in a political world built on noise, outrage, and spectacle, her refusal to scream became the loudest sound in America. Because maybe that's how change really happens. Not with a bang, but with a question, asked calmly, in public, with no apology and no fear.